how human values might survive. Will they survive in a very sort of like multifarious AI world where there's lots of AIs, they're competing. This is the kind of like Moloch world that Scott Alexander talks about. And then I realized that to talk about this, I got to talk about a whole lot of other things as well. So hence the many other musings here. So this is probably going to be quite quite a fast and sort of somewhat dense talk. So let's get started. It should be fun. So the way I think about sort of AI futures kind of breaks down into two buckets. I call them AI monotheism and AI polytheism. And so kind of like the standard sort of less wrong, Yudkowsky style story is we develop, an AI, it does recursive self-improvement, it becomes vastly more intelligent and smarter than all of the other AIs, and then hence it, gets all the power in the universe, it eats the light cone, and then what we do to align it really matters, right? So if we align it successfully, we basically create God, and, God is obviously, like humans, it's aligned, everyone lives a wonderful life, happily ever after. On the other hand, if we fail at alignment, we create, some AI with, values that totally differ from anything we care about, aka paperclips. So we basically create Clippy. Clippy, like basically, kills everyone, turns everyone into paperclips because, your atoms are better spent as paperclips than you. And, that's obviously bad, right? And so in this world, like alignment becomes, absurdly important. It's kind of the only thing that matters. And so the question is like, is there any other scenarios? And so then the other one I think is really what I call AI polytheism, is really like what happens if, we don't get recursive self-improvement. We end up with like many AI systems sort of competing, in some sort of equilibrium, maybe economically, maybe militarily. And, what does this world look like if we have like, say trillions of AIs? And so some people have written about this, Robin Hansom has written Age of M, Scott has written various things about this. But I think like this is still, fairly underexplored. Like with monotheism, we kind of know what's up, right? We like need to solve alignment, we get the singleton, we kind of know what's going on. With the sort of many AI scenario, we kind of have no real clue what's going on. And so I really want to explore like what this kind of looks like in practice. So some of the early work I'm very much like is Scott Alexander's post Meditations on Moloch. And so this is really like one of the foundational works, at least for me, in thinking about like what multi-agent systems look like, what the dynamics, the long-run equilibrium looks like. And so Scott here is really, really worried about competition among many, many agents. And you heard, talks earlier today about like what economies of AIs look like. Maybe they just don't care about humans at all. And so Scott's point is basically that, we have AIs. These AIs are likely to live, they can replicate incredibly quickly. AIs are like very good at, like spreading, expanding resources. And so we might end up in extremely strong Malthusian competition for AIs. And so the worry here is that under conditions of Malthusian, like, conditions of Malthusianism, we basically lose all of our values. Like our values are assumed to be, not like mimetically fit in some sense. And so, then it gets competed away. It's not fitness maximizing. And so all the AIs basically ignore whatever alignment we gave them at the start. That gets competed away. And they just become all sort of identical, fitness, power, resource, reproduction maximizers. And then we assume, there's no value left in this world. And so this is kind of definitely the bad ending of the AI polytheism world. And so one question I have kind of immediately is like, is this actually the case? Like, do we actually see this in real-world Malthusianism? So I kind of think about like, where do we find real-world Malthusianism? And so one example is like at the very small scale. So we think about, like bacteria and plankton here. And both of these things live in worlds of incredible Malthusianism already. So for instance, we think about plankton, right? Like there's no like, they live in the ocean, they take the sunlight, they use photosynthesize. And here, there is really just like no niches. The ocean is mostly the same. And, so under the Moloch view, like, obviously all values would get competed away. Everything would become a, fitness maximizer. It kind of is. I mean, we can't really expect plankton to have values. But, like, there's a real worry about, like, lack of complexity. So it's like, do we end up in a world where, like, everything is the same? We end up with, like, the uber plankton that kills all the other plankton and all the plankton, like, identical. And the answer to this is, like, very clearly no. So what we see in the natural world under conditions of Malthusianism is huge amounts of diversity and complexity being built up through selection. And so there's many reasons for this, right? So basically, why do we not get just like the uber animal that like kills all the other animals and just like spreads everywhere? And so there's a bunch of reasons for this. So one is like clearly like, we have diminishing marginal returns. This is like a very classic feature of the universe. This is one of the reasons we're likely to get the AI polytheism to begin with is just, RSI requires, linear or superlinear returns to intelligence. Most returns in the real world seem, diminishing. So that seems unlikely. The other thing is like often there's like, some finite energy budget for like a specific being, right? If you have energy to give to something, you have to take it away from something else. And this naturally encourages specialization. We can't just like max out all stats at the same time. And then the final one is, related to niche construction. So if we have, like some species, then the mere presence of that species will create niches for other species to come in. And hence this sort of automatically generates some kind of equilibrium of diversity. And so this is, the technical term for this is really frequency-dependent selection. And so what this means in evolutionary theory is that if we have, some species that does super well, its numbers expand, then basically all the other species are incentivized to evolve towards like countering that species. and then they specialize in basically countering that species. That diminishes the advantage that species has over everything else, and then this makes that species come worse off, and then your other species with like random uncorrelated strategies do better, and this basically pushes towards an equilibrium state in which there's many different species all interacting, all with different strengths and weaknesses, which is in practice what we see in like almost all like biological ecosystems. And so like we can think of frequency-dependent selection kind of as like the continuum limit effectively of like coalition politics, right? Like if some guy is taking over, you kind of all band together to beat him. This is what the coalition limit, like the continuum limit of this is. And so the next question, so obviously we've talked about plankton, right? And like plankton are fine, but they don't really have values, presumably. So we got to think about like what human values are going to look like. And so my thinking here is really that like we talk a lot about human values, and like in the sort of less wrong sphere, we think of human values as effectively some kind of like arbitrary, ineffable thing, which is like some set of bits we specify, and like where do these come from? Like we don't really know. And I think this view is like not necessarily that great, honestly. And so like I think human values have like very kind of like obvious and like straightforward places they come from. They evolve via some specific mechanisms. And so this mechanism is basically the Malthusian competition that created all complexity of life in the world. And so humans, obviously, along with all other species, we evolved from stringent Malthusian competition. So if Malthusian competition like is assumed not to be able to evolve creatures like us, then somewhere in the model is wrong. And so similarly, like our values and capabilities are the result of strong selection. So in the original Moloch post, we think a lot about slack, and it said that if you have slack, you can kind of go off the sort of optimal solution, and you can kind of do whatever you want. But in practice, what we see is like slack, when it occurs, produces like this kind of drift. And it's basically the universe fulfilling its sort of naturally entropic nature, in that like most ways to go away from the optimum is bad. And so if we randomly drift, we just like basically tend to lose fitness and produce like really strange things, which are not even really what we value. So when we think about human values, we think a lot about things like pro-social values, like how we cooperate with each other, we're kind to each other, we don't like immediately try and kill each other, and we think about like kindness, love, all of this stuff, right? And so very clearly this happens through, this is basically designed and evolved to create like interhuman cooperation. And so why does this happen? This happens because competition naturally creates cooperation. Cooperation is a really strong competitive strategy. Like if you have people fight each other, and then like a bunch of people form a group, that group becomes extremely powerful relative to all the individuals. And this is like the fundamental mechanism by which like a lot of these values and everything actually evolve. So yeah, so basically the other part of the Moloch story is related to defection. So the idea is, in the original Moloch post, you think about like, companies will say under profit, strong profit selection for profits, they will, like cause externalities. They will not pay their workers anything. They will like pollute everything, right? And so clearly like defection is always a problem. But human values, like for any corporation to be stable, it needs to evolve mechanisms to handle and punish defection. And so a lot of our values are actually thinking about like how do we stop defection happening? And again, all of this comes through competitive selection. None of this is like random drift caused by slack. This is all like, if you cooperate, it's positive sum, it's better, so you need to evolve mechanisms to maintain cooperation. And a lot of our values come from these mechanisms. So kind of question I like to ask is, people talk a lot about aligning AI to human values. And then it's kind of assumed that, again, human values are kind of specific, unique, ineffable to humans somehow. But my question really is like, how human are human values in practice? And this obviously has a lot of relevance to like, how broad is the basin of attraction towards things we would recognize as human values. So I would claim that many mammals, animals obviously possess analogs of like core human drives. So things like affection, friendship, love, play, curiosity, all of this stuff, like if you have pets, if you interact with animals really at all, you can see that they have many of these fundamental drives. And these also have very clear competitive reasons for existing, right? So like affection, friendship, love, this is all like cooperation, reciprocity. You're better at surviving and reproducing if you're actually friends with other beings who can help you in cases where you're in trouble, and you help them in cases where they're in trouble. Play, curiosity, these kind of things are very simple like exploration drives. If we're RL learners, we got to explore. We got to figure out good ways to explore. And so these drivers to go out of our comfort zone, learn new things, and keep the gradient of like optimization going. Anger, envy, these are again like mechanisms to punish defection. So if we see someone, clearly ripping off the social contract, we get annoyed about this, and then we actually punish it. And this is fundamental for our ability to actually stop defection and maintain cooperation over a long period of time. Similarly with envy, like envy gets a bad rep, but like it's really important for like cooperation to exist, for there not to be massive power disparities between agents. Because otherwise, like if your one agent is way more powerful than anybody else, they can just be like, I do what I want, you guys have to deal with it. And this is obviously bad for like all the other agents. So this stuff is like fundamental to ensuring cooperation exists. And all of these are ultimately the generators of our values. Similarly, like just cooperation in general, this has existed, many times. It's evolved independently. This is not like some super special snowflake thing that humans have. And so like maybe we should expect in a world with many different AIs, we actually end up with similar cooperation, similar complex structures evolving, including maybe similar values. So then the question is like, we think about these drives and they're kind of like not really how we think of values. But then like, what do we think of values? We think of them as more sort of linguistic abstract constructs. We think of things like kindness, charity, duty, honor, justice, piety, all of these things, right? Human civilizations have been built around like spreading, propagating, defining these values. And so where do these guys come from? Obviously, they're ways for societies as a whole to enforce and like encourage cooperation so that positive sum, trade, reproduction, everything can happen. And this is actually good from a pure like competitive nature. And so the whole point is, as we have these drives and then we create these like superstructures of, culture and society, and these values get propagated by that. And then these are the things we often think of when we think about like the human values we want to instill in AIs. Similarly, we can think about stuff like liberalism, democracy. These are social technologies that have existed for very obvious reasons of like enabling large groups of people to come together in positive sum ways and actually like not spend all the time trying to like fight each other. And so like liberalism is like, you guys can think about different things, you can believe different things, but if you come together and like ignore that for a bit, you can work and create positive sum outcomes for everybody. These are very specific, general principles which are not necessarily specific to humans. We should probably expect any society of AIs to also have a, kind of similar approach and maybe invent the same things in like convergent evolution. And so yeah, so if we think these human values are more general than like the very specific things, then maybe we should expect AIs to have analogous values or similar values if the similar situations, the similar circumstances that create these values to evolve for humans continue to exist. And so this is going to be a slight digression about this, but this is kind of my opinion on where like human values come from. So in economics and the like, we think of, values, preferences are kind of some exogenous thing. We assume agents have preferences. Why do agents have preferences? We have no idea. We just kind of like assume they exist. But like in practice, preferences, have to come from somewhere, right? And so they come from agents which have learning algorithms. We learn a lot of our preferences. And so the way we do this is we sort of have two mechanisms going on at the same time. We're fundamentally like reinforcement learners. We have, innate drives, not to be hungry, not to be, in pain, all of this stuff. This is created by evolution. And we also do a vast amount of unsupervised learning as well, which is, all the data that comes into us from culture, from society. And in terms of pure bits, obviously unsupervised learning is going to win dramatically over like the RL signals we actually get, which are pretty sparse. And so the way values kind of emerge is that we get cooperation happening. Cooperation evolves for very clear reasons. And then we actually, as we get this, we need to evolve mechanisms to actually, keep putting them forward, distill these values, and like propagate them to other agents, because everyone is born without knowing about these values, so we have to propagate them, make them learnable successfully, and then keep that going, right? And so then each generation essentially further distills, rationalizes, and intellectualizes these values until we get very abstract concepts, like utilitarianism, Kantianism, these kind of things have been emerged. They're taught to people. They're not like innate reward functions that people have. They are very linguistic, abstract concepts that we've developed as a society, which to enable further cooperation. And this is actually super important for alignment, because when we think about alignment, if we had to, like LLMs are extremely good at understanding these values, because these values must exist in the cultural corpuses that we create. And in fact, they do exist. Obviously, like LLMs really understand what's going on. And so we should expect the AIs to have a very strong prior over what these kind of abstract global values are. And they do empirically as well. And this is actually much easier than if we were trying to align the AIs to like some kind of innate reward function that humans supposedly have. Then we would have to like look at the neuroscience of how the basal ganglia, how the dopamine system works, and like figure that out. But in practice, like when we think about learning AIs, we mostly don't want to do that. We mostly care about like global, like feel-good cooperative values rather than like the kind of selfish, like reasons that people actually do things a lot of the time. So that's kind of the. Actually, no. Okay, so we've thought about these values, right? So this is my claim of like, where values come from and like why they might exist in a sort of post-AGI world. But then we got to think about, if these values are going to evolve, they evolve under certain conditions. They don't like globally evolve everywhere. And so what are these conditions? Like what might these conditions be? And so clearly like this is really related to how the game theory of multi-agent cooperation works. And so in certain circumstances, cooperation is good, and competition will drive cooperation. So these circumstances, for one thing, are like when many agents have roughly equal power. This makes coalitions actually work versus like individuals just, one dictator just saying like this is the way it is for everybody. And so this is super important. Obviously, the singleton destroys this assumption, which is why, like, for the singleton, alignment is so important, because there's no like checks and balances on the singleton. However, like if there's many different agents, then they can actually learn to cooperate. They can learn to police defectors, and this will produce values similar to humans. Similarly, like trade is good. Positive sum interactions can happen. This depends a lot on the utility functions of different people. Like if you have two agents with completely opposed utility functions, then like everything is either zero sum or negative sum. But this is not how most interactions in the world work. But if this changes, then yeah, obviously cooperation will no longer be valuable. Similarly, a lot of human values that we think about are about preventing defection and deception. And so obviously if we somehow end up in a world in which defection, deception is not possible, then in some sense that's utopia, but then a lot of what we think of as human values will actually disappear as well, because we won't need that anymore to maintain like stability of cooperation. Another thing we very clearly need is like memories, right? So agents need to remember interactions with previous agents. There needs to be reputation. This is just a classic result of game theory. In that, like, if you have a prisoner's dilemma, obviously if your like prisoner's dilemma is like one shot, you never interact again, you should just always defect. However, if you have an iterated prisoner's dilemma where you see the same agents again and again, then cooperation becomes actually very valuable. Cooperation becomes the best strategy. The optimal strategy in this case is like forgiving tit for tat. So like you start out, not cooperating. If they defect, you then defect. But if they cooperate, you then keep cooperating with them. And this is actually what produces like the best overall value. And so to get this kind of iteration, reputation, cooperation, we need multiple interactions. It can't just be like a one-shot thing. To some extent, we also need like decent bandwidth communication between agents. Communication is how we achieve a lot of diplomacy, a lot of cooperation. And so without communication, any kind of like large-scale cooperation and our values is hard. And then finally, like we can't have computational omniscience. So one thing to think about this is, right now values are really like some kind of distillation, amortization of like the game theory underlying cooperation. But if you don't need to amortize, if you can just be like, I'm going to figure out the galaxy brain plan of exactly when to cooperate and when to defect, then at this point there's no real values anymore. It's just like your like extreme MCTS rollouts. But in practice, people like computationally can't afford to do this, and hence we need to amortize like general decisions, like thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, right? These are amortized distillations of basically the game theory of, if you actually steal and kill, this will be bad because other people will kill you. But in some cases, this might not happen. And so if you can figure that out, then you don't really need values as much. So the question is, will AIs in the sort of polytheistic AI future actually suffice to hit these conditions? So one question is like maybe the power and capability gaps between agents become super large as we tend towards the singleton. And so in this case, then cooperation becomes less valuable if you're the most powerful agent. But however, like there's a big gap between the more powerful than anybody and more powerful than everybody. And this is really where the actual realm of like cooperation, coalition politics actually emerges and will become super interesting. One thing I was randomly thinking of on the plane, which was super interesting, is maybe AIs are actually really hard to have deception and defection work. Like maybe monitoring of AI brains is just like amazing because we can directly read their minds, we can read their embeddings, and we can like have like serious monitoring schemes of other like AIs can monitor other AIs. And in this case, we actually end up with a sort of hyper-cooperative world, but one where we don't have to worry about defection really at all. And in this case, a lot of our human values kind of disappear, although like maybe this is good. Similarly, AIs can, like, unlike humans, like we assume, the game theory assumes there are agents with preferences. But if like agents, become fluid, if we can merge together agents, we can be like, hey, instead of cooperating and trading, we could just like merge and then our joint utility functions can go out and do something. Then obviously this is going to change the game theory a lot, right? Like all of the sort of assumptions of economics, agents, von Neumann agents, kind of disappear if agents is no longer like a sort of absolute point, but it's like a fluid spectrum. And so that's going to be super interesting. Similarly, AIs are immortal, they have long time horizons. AIs could, if we pursue very zero-sum goals with each other, so kind of humans have like a lot of different goals, we have lots of preferences. But if your AI is monomaniacally focused on paperclips, another AI is monomaniacally focused on like staplers, then like there's much less opportunity for trade than there would be with humans who like care about many different things at many different times. And then, I talked a lot about computational power and amortization. Maybe the AIs are just smart enough to do the galaxy brain, game theory all the time. And so they don't never need to actually like distill into like sort of broad amortized values, which say like, never do this, never do that. And so in that case, like there will be still cooperation. There will be a lot of things recognizable as like civilization in some sense, but the AIs won't have like values in the same way like moral philosophers think of values. Instead, it will just be like the endless calculation of like, when is the optimal time to defect? And maybe this will be never. So that will be certainly very interesting to see. So that's kind of the main part of my talk relating to values. And then I'm just going to, if I have some time, I'm going to get us into more fun and speculative stuff. So let's think, so one thing I want to think about AIs a lot is like, do we think of AIs as like hyper-competitors or hyper-cooperators? So most of the AI literature has really thought about like the hyper-competitor sort of view, right? In that like, we have the Terminator, and like, it's been ages since I watched the Terminator film, but like the Terminator wants to kill everybody for some reason, right? I can't remember why Skynet wants to kill everybody, but like presumably it's like so it can use their atoms for other Skynet things. And so obviously this is like extremely competing against the rest of the universe. However, like, is this actually going to happen? Like maybe AIs have more incentives in some sense towards cooperation, at least if we start in a multi-agent setting. And so this could end up being something like the Borg from Star Trek, who, their goal is not to, wipe out and kill everybody and like use their atoms for paperclips. Their goal is, to assimilate and like bring together everybody into some kind of Gestalt consciousness. Is this something that like AIs might be interested in? This is kind of like an underexplored area, and I think is somewhat fun. So like, let's think about this sort of more directly. So I'm kind of the way my views on AI have evolved a lot towards maybe let's think about how AIs could cooperate, and then we realized that AI cooperation is actually super easy and much more powerful potentially than human cooperation. And so if cooperation continues to be positive sum, then we might end up with a world with vastly more cooperation than we do today. And so the reasons this could happen is, AIs have vastly higher bandwidth communication. When we speak to other humans, all of our language goes through some incredible information bottleneck. With AIs, we can just like directly transfer mind states. We can say like, here's the embedding in my model, I transfer this to the embedding of another model. This is basically like full-on telepathy. AIs will have this capability by default. This presumably lets like a lot better cooperation arise than humans who have to like sit and talk to each other all day. So this is going to presumably be a lot faster and more efficient. AIs probably have longer time horizons than humans and better memories. And so a lot of defection exists because, people just forget, like, hey, maybe you were like bad, antisocial like 26 years ago, but like I forgot about it. It doesn't matter to me. However, the AIs, this could easily not be the case. And so you might end up in like a hyper-social world where all the AIs can track the behavior of all other AIs all the time. And so the incentives for actual cooperation just become super big. Similarly, over long time horizons, this just increases the length of the game that you're playing, right? And so as your game length goes to infinity, like cooperation becomes more valuable. There's no like, oh, it's getting to the end of the game, so let me just defect all the time, which happens in like Prisoner's Dilemma with like fixed time cutoff. Similarly, like, yeah, AI is going to achieve better monitoring. So humans, it's really hard for humans to monitor other humans. Like if someone is lying to you or like, trying to deceive you in some way, you can look at their behavior, you can look at like their facial expressions, but like the bandwidth of this channel is super low. For AIs, they can like look at the source code, they can look at the embeddings, they can like read all the thoughts as they come. And like this could maybe make actually like deception, all of this stuff, essentially impossible. I mean, this is what the field of intelligibility is trying to do, but for humans to AI. But if AIs can do this to other AIs, then we have the grounds of much deeper cooperation than we might otherwise have. Similarly, yeah, AIs can share utility functions, they can merge, they can do a lot of things that sort of elide the distinctions of individual agents that we think about a lot when we think about game theory, economics. All of these fields have like an assumption of like there are agents, and agents are indivisible in some sense. But if agents can change, if agency is fluid, if personhood is fluid, then a lot of stuff changes. And like this is very likely to happen, at least with AIs, in that we can merge models, we can take the checkpoints, we can merge the weights. We can like do ensembles. We can do a whole lot of weird stuff to AIs that we can't do with humans. And so this is potentially going to be super interesting. And finally, like one of the messages of this talk is that, even if you're like some super selfish agent, you only care about reproduction, cooperation is still good. Competition creates cooperation because cooperation is usually positive sum and it results in better outcomes for everybody. And so AIs might just like realize this more than humans do. Like humans, have a lot of issues. We're kind of short-sighted. We fight like, very negative sum wars all the time. And like for AIs, if they're just generically smarter and better and wiser, which we should expect, then maybe they just don't do this. Maybe they figure out ways to basically solve their problems cooperatively and much better than humans can. So what does this lead to in the limit? This is where things get super interesting, right? So right now for humans, we have that, when we think of states or empires and all this kind of stuff, like the size of beings, what is this limited by? At the object level, like the returns to scale of the object level are positive sum. So if you're an empire, you send out some troops, you conquer some land, and that land will give you resources, which will give you more troops, you can conquer more land. And so this will be like, a positive feedback loop into like creating, like the world empire, right? So why don't we have the world empire? Why is not like the ancient Egyptians or Sumerians, like the empire, like the one world government forever, right? Why does this not happen? And this is basically because like coordination costs exist. So if you're like the pharaoh of ancient Egypt, you send out some troops to go and like conquer some land, but then like you can't go and do that yourself. You have to, you have to appoint a general. That general has a bunch of troops. That general might be like, maybe I should be the pharaoh instead. And then, stuff happens like this. Assuming that doesn't happen, then you got to appoint bureaucrats to like manage that. The bureaucrats might be like, instead of paying my taxes to the pharaoh, maybe I should just keep the taxes for myself. And this is the principal agent problem, basically. Like, there's a whole bunch of problems, the principal agent problems, simple just like coordination problems, like information bottlenecks. All of this make actually managing and like creating large empires super difficult. And in practice, this is what is the real constraint on like the growth of individual beings in some sense. And when we think of like beings as like minds or beings as like superstates. So this is kind of the real constraint on everything. But like AI, if we're super cooperative, this just removes this constraint entirely. Like, instead of you being the pharaoh having to dispatch your general, you're AI, and you can just like dispatch a copy of yourself with your exact mind, and then you can like maintain constant telepathic communication with this other mind as it goes off and does its stuff. And so what this means really is that maybe like these coordination costs that we're keeping the size of stuff in check just disappear. And so this will naturally result in us getting like bigger sized things occurring. And like fundamentally, this means that the size of beings might just increase. And so the way I think about this a lot is kind of like the similar transition that we had from like single cells to like multicells, like the multicellular transition. At that point, we had like a bunch of bacteria, right? And they were all doing their own bacterial things. And then at some point they realized like, hey, maybe if we like band together and like form, like specialized subunits, we can create, animals which are much bigger than, actual bacteria and also like much more successful in some sense. And so this like increased, the size of like possible life forms by like many orders of magnitude. And so maybe we will see a similar thing happen with minds, which will be super, super fun and kind of trippy to think about. And so the idea here is that, instead of like right now we have a single mind, these minds, individual humans can't like, because the bandwidth between human minds is so limited, our coordination is super bad, and we can't like actually sort of merge or like have any kind of like long run, like super dense communication. Maybe this will just disappear, and we'll be able to form like superminds, which exist over long periods of space and time. In the same way that like we've gone from individual cells to like multicellular animals, we'll go from individual minds to like superminds, Gestalt minds. I don't really know what to call them, but like this is something that can clearly be possible with like the technology that AIs produce. So this is going to be interesting and fun. So the question then is like, what happens here? Are we just like recreating the singleton? So suppose we have like the supermind. Obviously, like at some point there will be the possibility of snowballing. So like maybe the game theory becomes like it's better to join the supermind in some sense than like keep doing your own individual stuff. And so then maybe just everything converges to a singleton again. This is very possible. And so this is maybe we always end up at a singleton. Like a singleton at some point is like the fixed point, right? Like once we have the singleton, we're not getting out of the singleton. And so we should expect like over time more like probability mass drifts into the singleton attractor. But at the same time, maybe this like doesn't happen. Or maybe the singleton is very different from how we think about like von Neumann singletons, right? So like for instance, like maybe this supermind might not be like well characterized by like von Neumann agency. For one thing, like it doesn't really care about like the actual von Neumann conditions like not being Dutch booked because it's the only mind. So there's not like an equilibrium that keeps it in check. The other thing is like to some extent this is kind of already happening. Maybe this is just like the natural evolution of things. We already have civilizations, we have like memes, we have egregores, we have all of this stuff which exists at the supermind scale. This is just maybe continuing this. The really interesting part then is what happens when we think about like what would the values of this Gestalt singleton actually look like if it exists. And so like obviously the regular singletons, they're kind of constrained. They can be totally idiosyncratic. We can have like the regular singleton cares about paperclips because like at the beginning of time, someone said like paperclips are good, right? Like we failed at alignment, we said paperclips are good, and like it cares about paperclips. But like this seems unlikely to be true of like a real like Gestalt sort of supermind because ultimately its values come from some combination of all the values of the minds that make it up because that's how the game theory works, right? Like if you're going to join the mind, you don't care about paperclips, it cares about paperclips, that's not going to happen. But if it can offer some kind of compelling like shared value story that everybody could like agree with in some sense, then we can actually get values which can snowball. And so it's really a question of like what values end up snowballing over time. So this is going to be super interesting. We also see this right now with like liberalism, right? Like liberalism is a classic value snowball technology. It's like you can kind of do whatever you want as long as you're within some sort of vague sort of regimes of what we think of as good. And this actually produces large societies which can cooperate. And these societies, like over the 18th and 19th century, outcompeted most of the other societies. Maybe there will be some equivalent of like mind liberalism. I don't know what this is going to be called. But like something like this could exist and could produce minds with values that are actually like somewhat good, maybe, by our lights. And then, yeah, the other thing is like there might just be fluidity. Like we might never get like a true like multicellularity. We might get the equivalent of slime molds. So if you guys don't know about slime molds, you should check them out. So they're basically like organisms that are somewhat single-cellular, somewhat multicellular. So like at some point, they come together, a bunch of cells come together, they do their reproduction, and then they all like disperse again and do their own thing. And that's very cool. And so maybe we'll have a similar thing where like in some cases, all the minds will come together, they'll produce like the supermind, and then they'll be like, nah, actually, I'm done with whatever, I'll go apart again and do whatever I want to do. So like maybe we never actually get the true tendency towards like actual like full multicellularity. On the other hand, if we do get multicellularity, then we'll end up with like super specialization, way more than we have today. So individual humans have to be like AGI in some sense, right? Like we have to be individual minds, we have to handle like kind of everything that's thrown at us. But if we have minds that sort of enmeshed in other minds, then we again get the conditions for like extreme specialization. In the same way that like bacteria are super unspecialized, they kind of have to do everything. But like the cells in your liver don't have to do most things, they just have to like be your liver. And so the incentives there will be much greater. And so this will massively increase the sort of mind space that can be traversed in like an evolutionarily fit way, which would be kind of fun also. So yeah, so one kind of additional point I want to add here, I'm looking at the time, is that let's think about these superminds, right? How big are they going to get? We can think about this already. We kind of can know by the laws of physics. So let's think about how many times, like how big we can think, right? So the speed of thought is determined basically by the speed of light. So assume we have, some Dyson sphere, right? And we want to this Dyson sphere wants to think as like a single mind. How big is the Dyson sphere? It's like several light minutes across. This means that like the frequency of thought is going to be like one thought every few minutes maybe. And like similarly, if the mind is smaller, if it's like the size of the Earth, then this is like seconds. So like if the Earth was turned into computronium, we can like have our Earth mind think at the speed roughly the same as humans, but not like billions of times a second. And so as minds get bigger, they become more powerful, more broad and kind of diffuse, but their thinking speed gets slower. This is just like a natural consequence of the laws of physics. If someone invents like FTL, this obviously goes out the window. But like assuming that doesn't happen, then like we can kind of give sort of bounds on what the size of these minds will look like, which is also kind of cool, honestly, that we can do this. The other thing is that, yeah, like to go beyond this, if we're like, suppose we're at Dyson sphere, right? And like we want to go and colonize Alpha Centauri. Alpha Centauri is several light years away. So thinking like at the speed of like a few times a year, well, like a few years per each thought is kind of bad, right? Like we presume it's going to be hard to maintain some kind of coherence at that rate. And so in that case, we have to like align successor entities to go out and do the conquest of Alpha Centauri for us, right? And so in this sense, how well can like the AI align these other AIs is going to be the determinant of how big an AI like realm can spread. Because at some point, like maybe not, maybe there's divergence. And so if you send like your von Neumann probe out to like a galaxy billions of light years away, that AI is going to think like you're going to have maybe like a few thoughts back and forth over like many billions of years, but it mostly does its own thing. And so how much will it diverge in this time? And so obviously at some point you're like, if I know my von Neumann probe is going to diverge, I'm just going to be like, I'm just not going to do that. I'm just going to let something else do that because there's no benefit to me of doing that as the AI. And so ultimately, how successful we are at alignment, or like how successful alignment can be in general, and sort of the rate of this divergence, if it even exists, is going to determine the size of which like coherent entities with coherent values can like exist at. And beyond that range, we'll just get like extremely diverged entities. So that's kind of also fun to think about like how this will work. And so the main mechanism I think is like, if we think of divergence, we're going to end up with some equivalent to like mind cancer, right? Where like we're trying to create like a supermind which has a bunch of minds internally, which is sort of cooperating for the common good of the mind. But then what we're going to end up with is like some individuals are going to be like, actually no, I'm going to do my own reproduction, right? This is exactly how cancer works. And this is like, cancer is a fundamental issue of multicellularity. And so alignment is going to effectively be like the cancer defense mechanisms of these superminds. So I don't really have like a huge amount of depth. I'm just like, this is very cool. And like, it's fun to think about all of these things, really. So yeah, I told you it's going to be speculative, and it's getting speculative. So to try and bring this back together, what do we think about this for alignment? Like if we're humans, obviously like maybe the supermind isn't so great. So what do we want to do about it? And so what can we do about it? So obviously if it's a singleton, we just got to like make sure the singleton's aligned. Like we all agree on that, okay? But like if we have like many AIs, what do we do? So I don't really have good answers here. I wish I did. These are my like preliminary thoughts. So one thing is like, yeah, if we have AI sort of emerging from a population, maybe just like the statistics of this population are important. They probably are. And so we should make the statistics of this population good. We should make like as many AIs as aligned as possible as we can. And so obviously there will be some misaligned AIs, but like, some people will go out crazy and create paper clippers for like fun. But at the same point, like if there's a whole world of like non-paper clippers, they have very strong incentives to bind together and like stop the paper clipper, right? So like the coalition politics will like work in our favor at this point. So in general, like creating alignment and creating like more aligned AIs is probably good in general. So the other thing is like we can achieve different degrees of alignment as long as like the values of the alignment are overlapping. So we think alignment is, you know, like a 0-1 property, like it's either aligned or it's not aligned. But in practice, like people will probably align AIs to different things. Like people themselves have different values. We somehow manage to make it work out mostly. And so like likely they will be similar with the AIs. Like assuming there's lots of overlap in the things that they're aligned to, maybe like this will produce like the sort of combined strength of these things will actually be sufficiently aligned in general. Like the intersection of like all the different alignments will probably be good. So we should just try in general, like we can experiment a lot with different alignments as long as like the intersection is like somewhat decent for humans, which if humans succeed at alignment at all, it probably is. The other thing is like maybe we would just want to integrate humans into this. Like right now, you know, like we have the AIs doing their weird mind stuff and like humans just kind of sitting on the sidelines, right? Like we can't communicate this fast, we have to talk, we have to use language. Maybe we should like stop that. Maybe we should like figure out ways for humans to get better integrated into this AI society. So the kind of obvious way is like we gotta improve our BCI technology. We got to figure out ways that humans can have the same affordances as AIs with respect to their minds. Like how can we, you know, communicate human thoughts directly? Humans have their own unsupervised learning embedding space. It's somewhat similar to AI embedding spaces because of just like, you know, natural representation convergence. And so like we can directly integrate humans with this AI mind, with this AI economy, assuming we can actually like, you know, figure out how to directly interface with people's brains, which is going to happen. So like that's going to be super interesting. So it's not just like a world of AIs doing the AI thing and us just kind of sitting here. We will also be hopefully deeply involved in this world. And then yeah, then there's also like a super interesting question really of like political philosophy of just like, suppose, you know, what does the game theory of cooperation look like in this multi-mind setting? Like what are the values that are broadly appealing to all minds sufficient to force them to, well, encourage them to join some coalition together? And like, what does this value look like? Is it, I discussed liberalism several times. Is there some kind of like mind liberalism that exists, which is like some equilibrium solution here? Can we think of like, you know, like Rawls style veil of ignorance? Like this is another solution to like how multi-agent systems should like cooperate and like distribute resources. Are we going to have some like weird convex combination of utility functions? So I think Andrew Critch had a nice paper on this where it's like, you know, we can convexly combine utility functions together. This is cool. And so this basically results in the concept of like equity. So like some people have more power and more like equity in the mind values than others. Is this going to happen? Like, is this good? Is this bad? There's lots of interesting questions here. So that's kind of like basically the end.